Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Xi Jinping has spoken to Zelensky. He still wants to mediate. He promises to be neutral. The world is nodding politely, but nobody seems to be buying China's pitch. So will the conversation lead to anything meaningful? Also, why did Xi Jinping have it now? Was this an attempt at damage control? On Vantage tonight, we'll break it down for you. In Washington, a state visit is making waves. Headlines talk of a nuclear submarine and a presidential concert. The South Korean president sang a song. Biden gifted him a guitar. But none of it is music to North Korea's ears. In the Sudan, the fighting continues. We look at the role of foreign players in this conflict. In the United Nations, India did some straight talking. Is it the UN or mock UN? In New Delhi, the defense ministers of India and China are meeting. We'll tell you what can be expected from these talks. A black hole is in the news, and ChatGPT. Would you let it be your therapist? We'll discuss all of this and more. The headlines first. Amid health concerns, Turkish President Erdogan addresses an event. He's unveiled a Russian-built nuclear plant by video link. On Tuesday, the 69-year-old leader had to cut short a television interview after falling sick. Erdogan also cancelled his election campaigning yesterday. Turkey goes to polls on the 14th of May. Russian missile strikes Mykolaiv in Ukraine, this even as Moscow continues to pound Bakhmut and Kherson. NATO claims promised combat vehicles have been delivered to Kiev. The Kremlin says relations with Europe are at their lowest. Iran urges Lebanon to overcome political deadlock and elect a president, warning foreign governments to not interfere. Crisis at Lebanon has been without a president for almost 6 months now. America's Bain & Company is the latest target of China's crackdown. Authorities question staff of the American consulting company at their Shanghai office. This comes just weeks after 5 Chinese nationals were held in Beijing. They were all working for the Mintz Group, which is another US firm. Japan sets a 30% target for female executives at big firms. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida sets a deadline of 2030 to achieve this goal. There are just over 11% women executives at major companies in Japan as of now. And in a historic first, the Pope allows women to vote at an upcoming meeting of bishops. It's the first such move in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. It has finally happened. Xi Jinping picked up the phone yesterday. He spoke with Ukraine's President Zelensky, and the result is this. Ukraine is sending an ambassador to China, and Beijing will send a peace delegation to Kiev. Also, China promises to be neutral in its mediation. Wonder how that'll work. But let's try to break it down. A phone call was long expected. Xi Jinping had not spoken to Zelensky since the war began, and yet the timing of this call is interesting. Also, the contents of it. China shares with Russia what it calls a no-limits partnership, but it tells Ukraine it will be neutral in the war. Seems like Xi Jinping is going out of his way to accommodate, which is quite unlike him. Is he doing it just to position himself as a peacemaker, or is he doing it as part of damage control? Because just a few days back, his top diplomat committed a blunder. He said former Soviet states are not independent, which also means Ukraine is not an independent country to begin with. Obviously, it met with an angry response, not just from Ukraine, but also many others in Europe. So by promising neutrality and reaching out to Ukraine, is Xi Jinping trying to salvage the situation? He made the phone call to Zelensky yesterday. It lasted for 1 hour. An hour-long phone call between 2 heads of state is a big deal. And what did Xi tell Zelensky? I have some quotes. China has always stood on the side of peace, he says. China will neither watch the fire from the other side nor add fuel to the fire, let alone take advantage of the crisis to profit. That's a clear jibe at America, the main ally of Ukraine, also the chief supplier of weapons. So China is positioning itself as the opposite of America. What does it propose to do next? Send a special representative to Kiev.
China will send special representative of the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs to Ukraine and other countries and hold talks with all parties on resolving the Ukraine crisis there.
What about Zelensky? What did he think about the phone call? Zelensky seemed cautious. He said the phone call was quote-unquote long and meaningful. We say that comment is polite and vague. The question is, will Zelensky accept China's peace plan? Will he negotiate with Russia, with China as mediator? He didn't say that. Listen to this.
Говорив сьогодні із лідером Китаю.
Right now, there's an opportunity to give new energy to the relations between Ukraine and China. We also have the opportunity to use China's political power to reinforce the principles and rules that peace should be built upon.
Zelensky wants to see how this pans out. Well, don't we all? He's appointed an ambassador to Beijing. Remember, earlier Ukraine was quite eager to engage with China. Before the war began, in fact, Kiev and Beijing had good relations. By 2019, China was Ukraine's largest trading partner, and China too relied on Ukraine for many things, like barley, iron ore, corn, even defense supplies. In fact, Ukraine was China's second largest arms supplier, and there's an interesting backstory here. China's first aircraft carrier is a ship called Liaoning. It was a discarded Soviet vessel. Ukraine had it. In the 1990s, Kiev sold this aircraft carrier to Beijing. Then the Chinese Navy refurbished it, and it was put into service in the year 2012. That should tell you how deep the ties ran. But that was then. The picture has changed now. Russia's invasion has completely altered the dynamics. China may say it's a neutral player, but its actions do not match its words. China shares a close relationship with Russia, so much so that it does not even call the war an invasion. You know what the Chinese call it? A crisis. As vague and non-committal as it gets. And this is why Ukraine is wary of China's intentions. Plus, it has allies who are at odds with China, like the US. America has called the phone conversation a good thing that may not lead to anything meaningful. I have the statement from the White House. This is what it says. We welcome the news that there was a phone call between President Xi and President Zelensky. We think that's a good thing. Now, whether that's going to lead to some sort of meaningful peace movement or plan or proposal, I just don't think we know that right now. So the Americans are skeptical. What about Europe? Europe is doing what it does best, hedging. It says it's up to Kiev to decide what's best.
Peace will be decided, and it's up to Ukraine to decide in which terms. And in the meantime, we will continue supporting Ukraine. I very much welcome this phone call between President Xi and President Zelensky.
Russia too had a guarded response. The Kremlin welcomed the phone call, but Moscow still wants to continue fighting in Ukraine.
We are ready to welcome anything that could hasten the end of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia achieving all the goals it has set itself. As for the fact that they communicated, that is a sovereign matter for each of these countries and a question of their bilateral dialogue.
So those are the reactions. Now let's try to read between the lines. Why is Xi Jinping interested in Ukraine? What's driving his push to mediate? Of course, there's the appeal of being seen as a global statesman, but more than that, Xi Jinping wants to improve his relationship with Europe. China wants to separate Europe from the US. It wants to drive a wedge in the Western alliance and weaken American influence. It was on course to doing that, but first the pandemic hit. And then Russia's war forced Europe to reassess its ties with China. Also, America's trade war was putting pressure on the European Union. So this month, Beijing launched a charm offensive. First, it tried to court French President Macron. The gains were limited, though. A trade war with Lithuania intensified, and Brussels challenged China at the World Trade Organization. To make matters worse, a Chinese wolf warrior spoke out of turn. China's ambassador to France questioned the sovereignty of former Soviet states. It triggered a storm and uncomfortable questions for Beijing. If it doesn't even believe in Ukraine's independence, how can China be a legitimate peace broker? And that's when Xi Jinping had to come into the picture. He made the phone call when he did to try and change the perception about China's legitimacy as a mediator. But it may be too late. Unless Xi pulls a rabbit out of the hat, chances of him mediating in the conflict look bleak. Forget legitimacy, the Americans will not agree. And without them, the Ukrainians will not move. We keep talking about 4-day work weeks. But someone tell the South Korean president he's on a 6-day state visit to the United States. Long by modern standards. Let's focus on Wednesday. That's when President Yoon Suk-Yeol visited the White House. The day began with some heavy diplomacy, nuclear weapons, North Korea, the Indo-Pacific, really hard geopolitical stuff. But the day ended with a presidential concert. At the state dinner, President Yoon took the mic. He belted out an American favorite from the 1970s. It's called American Pie. Listen to this.
A long, long time ago, something touched me deep inside the day the music died.
If the Korean conflict ever comes to a sing-off, we know the result. Apparently, Yoon loved this song when he was in school, though clearly not music school. Jokes aside, Biden also had a gift for Yoon. He gave him this guitar. It was signed by Don McLean, the artist who composed American Pie.
Don McLean.
Don McLean. Don McLean.
All in all, it was a lovely event, one that was tailor-made for television. Tuxedos, music, champagne toasts. This is diplomacy from a different era, long before virtual bilaterals became the norm. So that was the state dinner. Now let's rewind to the more important part of the day, the bilateral and the joint statement. This visit by President Yoon is important for three reasons. Number one, the timing. The last state visit by a Korean leader was in the year 2011. It's been more than a decade. Number two, the background. North Korea has been on a testing spree this year, 26 projectiles and 11 test launches. That is Pyongyang's record until March. And reason number three, the China factor. South Korea is one of Washington's oldest and most important allies in Asia. It's also a key part of the global chip supply. Their market share is 18%, and the plan is to expand that footprint. Samsung is investing $230 billion to build 5 new chip plants. That's what America wants from Seoul. They design the chips, South Korea manufactures them. But what does South Korea want in return? In one word, security. Their neighbor to the north is a nuclear rogue state. It's ruled by an impulsive and reclusive dictator. So Seoul's priority is deterrence. How can they stop Kim Jong-un from using his nukes? On Wednesday, Biden unveiled a plan for that. He called it the Washington Declaration. He also said that an attack on South Korea would end Kim Jong-un's regime. Listen to this.
Nuclear attack by North Korea against the United States or its allies or partisans or partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of whatever regime were to take such an action.
Strong words from President Biden, but the question is, what specific steps would the U.S. take? President Yoon seemed confident of a nuclear response. He says America would use nukes if Pyongyang attacked.
Our two countries have agreed to immediate bilateral presidential consultations in the event of a North Korean nuclear attack and promised to respond swiftly, overwhelmingly, and decisively using the full force of the alliance, including U.S. nuclear weapons.
Let me explain in simple terms. Yoon believes America will use nuclear weapons if North Korea attacks them. It's called extended deterrence. I'll tell you what the problem with that is. North Korea has missiles that can reach American cities. So here's the question. Will Biden or any other US president sacrifice Los Angeles or San Diego or San Jose to defend Seoul? Unlikely, right? And that's the worry for South Korea. They're hoping that the Washington Declaration will help their case. 2 points stand out in this declaration. One, the nuclear plan sharing. You see, the US military has a plan of action if North Korea attacks, like what assets to deploy, which cities to target. The idea is to share these plans with Seoul, also take their inputs while creating future plans. I know it doesn't sound like much, but think back to your high school days. Remember when everyone knew a rumor and you did not? Well, that's what Seoul feels like right now. Perhaps they won't after the Washington Declaration. The second part of this plan is deploying nuclear submarines to South Korea. It hasn't happened since 1981, and most experts agree that this is largely symbolic. Why is that? Because submarines have very long ranges. You don't really need to dock in South Korea to attack the North. You can do that from the open sea. Either way, the broad idea is to calm the nerves in South Korea, especially among ordinary people. Between 60 and 70% of all South Koreans want nuclear weapons, either their own or American ones, to be shared. President Biden has made it clear that he will not deploy nukes to the Korean peninsula. Instead, he is betting on the Washington Declaration. It may work in the short term, but in the long term, the Korean conflict needs a political solution. It requires North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. Will Kim Jong-un do that? From the looks of it, Joe Biden has not even asked. His reluctance to engage with Kim has left him with few options. He has been forced to share nuclear plans and send submarines to Seoul. We all know how Kim will see these moves. So banquets and signed guitars will not solve the Korean conflict. Only diplomacy will. Maybe Biden should put down the mic and pick up the phone. Speaking of which, the United Nations is the embodiment of diplomacy. At least it was supposed to be. Nowadays, most countries are losing patience with the UN. They can't stop wars. They can't stop military takeovers. So many countries are asking, what's the point? Why have a sitting duck organization? And India too is wondering the same. Recently, the UN Security Council held an open debate. The topic was this: effective multilateralism through the defense of the principles of UN Charter. I know it's a mouthful, but frankly, it sums up the United Nations. A lot of talk, but no action. India's UN envoy had some tough words during this debate. She says the gap between the UN and mock UNs seems to be shrinking. Listen in.
We are collectively aware of the inadequacies of the multilateral system that has failed to respond to contemporary challenges, whether it be the COVID pandemic or the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Moreover, significant global challenges such as terrorism, radicalism, climate justice and climate action, disruptive non-state actors, debt and several geopolitical contestations continue to undermine global peace and security.
Quick side note, mock UNs are role-play events in colleges and schools. Students pretend to be countries of the world. They discuss real issues, but the impact is nil. India is asking whether the United Nations is becoming a mock UN. And this isn't criticism from any country. This is from India, a founding member of the United Nations, also the largest democracy in the world. So criticism from India is criticism from 1.4 billion people, and that's not something the UN can ignore. If you listen to the Indian envoy's statement, three things stand out. Number one, she said multilateral institutions rarely die, they fade into irrelevance. And she's right. It's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. America's war on Iraq was one cut. Russia's war on Ukraine is another. Secondly, she said the UN perpetuates the 1945 mindset. What does that mean? In simple words, a moving on problem. The Second World War ended in the year 1945, and currently we are in 2023. Almost 8 decades have passed, yet the Security Council membership has not changed. It still reflects the result of World War II. Which brings us to the third point. The Indian envoy pointed out that Africa and Latin America are excluded from the UNSC. We're not talking about one or two countries, we're talking about entire continents. Africa is home to more than 1.4 billion people. Latin America is home to more than 600 million people. Yet they have no voice in the United Nations Security Council. At the same time, a tiny island off Europe with 60 million people does. I'm talking about Britain. And why is that? Because once upon a time, they won a war. I could say the same about France or the US or China. The fact is, the UN must change. It must reflect the new global order. And how do you do that? For starters, by expanding the UN Security Council. There is no excuse to keep India out anymore. This is a country of 1.4 billion people, not to mention a major military player with a nuclear arsenal. I know a lot of people will say a UNSC membership will be an honor for India. I say it's the other way around. Including India will enrich the United Nations Security Council. It will make the council more representative and powerful. Same with Africa and Latin America. Don't think of this as a favor from bigger powers. Think of it as countries claiming their rightful place. But the question is, how do we make this happen? If you want to expand the UNSC, you need all the 5 permanent members on board. That's America, Britain, France, Russia, and China. India's membership is supported by 4 of them. Guess the odd one out. China. The African Union has also supported India's entry, so one country is holding reforms hostage, and that country is China. But some of the blame also lies with the West. They keep saying India should get a UNSC seat. But what have they done to make it happen? Have they held discussions with China? Have they offered concessions to get China on board? The truth is, they're happy with the status quo. In this setup, they can tell smaller states what to do while doing the exact opposite themselves. That is the sad reality of the United Nations. It was created to resolve big power rivalries. Instead, it has become hostage to it. In fact, I can give you another example of UN failure. The conflict in the Sudan. Rival generals began fighting for power on the 15th of April. Right now, the situation is delicate. There's a ceasefire on paper, but fighting continues in some parts. Around 500 people have been killed in the violence. That's the official number. The real toll is expected to be much higher. Hospitals and shops in Khartoum are running low on supplies. So thousands of citizens have decided to flee. Some of them are crossing the Nile on ferries. Others are trudging through deserts. The United Nations says around 270,000 people could flee to South Sudan and Chad. The problem with that? These countries are poorer than Sudan. They do not have the resources to host so many refugees. At the same time, staying behind is not an option. The US brokered ceasefire will end on Friday. Nobody knows what will happen after that. The Sudanese army has agreed to talks on extending the ceasefire, but the rival group, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, are yet to agree. So right now, it could be the calm before the storm. Other countries are using this lull to evacuate their citizens. India, for instance, has evacuated 360 people. Britain has evacuated more than 500. Saudi Arabia has taken out more than 2,000. And China is planning to evacuate more than 800 people. The question is, what happens next? As things stand, this is a power struggle, a rivalry between 2 ambitious generals. But that could very well escalate into something bigger. Time for a quick history lesson. The Sudan has a long history of civil wars, at least 3 since the 1950s. The longest one began in 1983 and ended in the year 2005. That's more than 20 years. So if this military rivalry grows beyond Khartoum, it would be disastrous. But who can stop it? Most big powers are keeping a close watch on the Sudan, especially the US, Russia, and the Gulf states. Each has their own motive. Reports say Russia is backing the RSF. Western media believes the Wagner group is providing arms to them. But what's in it for Putin? In 2017, Russia set up a naval base in Port Sudan. It's a strategic location on the Red Sea. Russia is also eyeing the lucrative gold mines of Sudan. The US, meanwhile, has emphasized on a democratic transition. That's what Antony Blinken told both generals: end the fighting, introduce civilian rule. Washington's main concern is the possibility of rising extremism. Until 2020, the Sudan was on the terror sponsor list. It was removed only after Khartoum agreed to recognize Israel. If you go back to the 1990s, Sudan hosted Osama bin Laden. He stayed in the country for 5 years. And I'm not saying the generals will promote extremism. I'm saying their civil war could create fertile ground for it. As for the Gulf states, it's wait and watch. Both the generals have fought for Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Experts say there is no point picking a side. They would rather wait out the conflict and back the winner. Where does that leave the people of Sudan? Alone and scared. The Sudan was once the largest country in Africa. It has reserves of gold, uranium, marble, and iron ore. It is also flanked by the longest river in the world, the Nile. On paper, this country has everything it needs to succeed: abundance of people, abundance of land, and abundance of resources. What it did not have was visionary leadership. And the world couldn't care less. The big powers considered Sudan to be a basket case, another war-ravaged land ripe for aid. It's a reflection of how inherently biased the global order is. Despite 2 world wars, despite years of dictatorships, you won't find a single failed state in Europe or North America. But you will find dozens within a few thousand kilometers in Africa. Let's talk about a different conflict now, India-Pakistan. Of course, there isn't an ongoing war between the 2 countries, but that hasn't stopped Pakistan from obsessing over the possibility. Over the last few days, there has been a spate of comments. The first bombshell was dropped by journalist Hamid Mir. He quoted General Bajwa, the former army chief of Pakistan. Bajwa apparently said that Pakistan knew it could not defeat India in a war, that Pakistan did not have the tanks that worked or diesel for troop movements. That's what Hamid Mir said. Listen to this.
याद है ना क्या लेक्चर था? टैंक चलने के काबिल नहीं है,
तो आप कह रहे हैं
की मूवमेंट के लिए मेरे पास डीजल नहीं है,
बेशक,
ठीक है जी, इस तरह की बातें की थी ना।
नॉर्मली ऐसा आर्मी चीफ के कोर्ट मार्शल होना चाहिए, और मुझे अब कहना पड़ेगा, मैं अंदर कमरे में कहती रही हूँ, बट मुझे कहना पड़ेगा कि इस तरह नहीं होता।
20-25 सहाफियों को सामने बिठा के आप उनको कह रहे हैं कि पाकिस्तान आर्मी लड़ने के काबिल,
इसका मतलब आप दुनिया को बता रहे।
Now obviously this went viral. It put Pakistan's military on the back foot, and that's not something they can afford. After all, Pakistan is an army with a country. Unlike most other countries which have armies, in Pakistan the army has a country, and it's a country that the army runs. It also runs businesses. It controls governments. It siphons off billions from the economy, and it cannot afford to appear incompetent, especially in a potential conflict with India. So the army responded to the video. Listen to what Pakistan's military spokesperson, Major General Ahmad Sharif Chaudhry, had to say.
और अगर जरूरत पड़ी तो वी कैन टेक दिस बैटल इनटू द एनिमीज टेरिटरी। मैं यहां पर यह कहना भी जरूरी समझता हूं कि अगर किसी मिसकैलकुलेशन या गलतफहमी की वजह से हिंदुस्तान कोई मुहिमजोई करने का सोचता है, इरादा करता है, तो अवामी हौसले और अवाम की सपोर्ट के साथ अफवाज पाकिस्तान उसको भरपूर जवाब देगी।
Strong words, no doubt intended to reassure Pakistan's public, to tell them that billions in taxes are not going to waste and that their economic crisis is worth it. But then came another statement, this one from a diplomat, a retired diplomat, Abdul Basit. He was the High Commissioner of Pakistan to India between 2014 and 2017. Now he's a regular guest on Pakistani news channels. And here's what he said, Abdul Basit. Now people in Pakistan are talking about another surgical strike or air strike by India. I do not think that now they will do the same because they're holding SCO meet and G20 presidency this year. I don't see any misadventures from India till the time they hold presidencies. But next year during elections, India may do this again. This may happen just before the elections in India. Well, why do Pakistanis fear an airstrike? Because last week there was a terrorist attack in India. In the Poonch district of Jammu and Kashmir, 5 Indian soldiers were killed. And now it seems Pakistanis are worried that India will retaliate, that India will carry out a Balakot-style strike. It happened in 2019. India conducted a bombing raid. It hit terrorist camps in Pakistani territory in a place called Balakot. This strike marked a dramatic shift in India's response to Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. And it appears that Pakistanis are now worried about a repeat. If you put all these comments together, one thing becomes amply clear. Pakistan is obsessed with the prospect of war with India. The two countries have fought 4 wars, 1947, 1965, 1971 and 1999, and each time Pakistan has lost. So tanks or no tanks, diesel or no diesel, the prospects for Pakistan look bleak. Their economy is crumbling, their political institutions are compromised, their proteges in the Taliban are now firing at them, their lenders in China are disenchanted, and yet what is it that makes it to the national discourse? Another war with India. If misplaced priorities were an Olympic sport, Pakistan would be the gold medalist. Now let's talk about China's relationship with India. It hasn't been great, and that's putting it mildly. The distrust was old, but now there's open hostility. In May 2020, China tried to invade Indian territory, and since then, things have been going downhill. There have been 18 rounds of talks, but no breakthrough. Could things change now? We ask because the Chinese defense minister is in India. His name is Li Shangfu. He's here for a meeting of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Also a meeting with India's defense minister Rajnath Singh. Their first bilateral meeting in all these years. And we've said this before. The solution to the conflict will not be military. It will have to be political. So could this meeting be the beginning of that? Here's a report.
Are better India-China ties around the corner? An end to the past few years of hostility? Is a new Asian dawn about to break? We don't know about the third point, but perhaps a thaw in India-China ties is imminent. China's defense minister Li Shangfu is in India. He's here for a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The SCO is a regional grouping conceived by China. India is a member and it's hosting the group this year. That's why Lee is in New Delhi. All the defense ministers of SCO member nations are going to have a meeting. But Lee has another engagement while he's in India. He's having a bilateral meeting with Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh. On the agenda is finding a way out of the mess at the India-China border. In May 2020, China had attempted to invade Indian territory. This took place in the northern Union territory of Ladakh. The Chinese troops encroached into Indian territory till they were confronted by Indian troops. There were multiple clashes. The deadliest took place on June 15th. 20 Indian soldiers died in the melee. China says it lost 4 soldiers. Other sources like US intelligence say that China lost 20 to 35 troops. Cooler heads have prevailed after that. There have not been any deaths since. But there's been no disengagement either. There have been multiple rounds of military talks. This is when senior military officials from the Indian Army and China's People's Liberation Army meet. They've discussed de-escalating the situation at the border. The 18th such discussion took place last week. But progress has been slow. So now, all eyes are on the talks between Singh and Lee in New Delhi. The fact that these talks are taking place is significant. Because remember, they were publicized. These aren't impromptu talks at the sidelines, but a full-blown bilateral meeting. It implies that China is serious about coming to the negotiating table. Now you may ask why. Why now after years of stalling? 2 factors stand out. One, Chinese President Xi Jinping will likely be in India in September. He'll be coming to attend the G20 meeting that India is hosting. It's understandable that he wants the visit to go off without a hitch. So ironing out border tensions could serve Xi's agenda. The other reason is China's new geopolitical avatar. As the world's purported peacemaker, Beijing brokered a normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It proposed a peace deal for the Ukraine war. China looks to position itself as a global power for peace. That's hard to do if it's causing border problems for its neighbors. To actually be a credible peace broker, China has to get its own house in order. That too urgently. This factor could have helped set the stage for today's talks. Now what comes of this remains to be seen. We'll keep you updated.
Our next story is about the dollar. It seems China has declared a war on the greenback. Beijing is striking deals, strengthening trade ties and asking partners to switch to the yuan to settle their bills. First, Brazil made the switch. Now Argentina has entered the club. Argentina will use the yuan for trade with China and they'll start this month. They're getting $1 billion worth of imports in the month of April and the payment for this will be done in the Chinese currency. But why is Argentina doing this? Let me explain. This year, Argentina suffered a crippling drought. Crop yields were less, so agricultural exports plunged, which meant that fewer dollars were flowing into Argentina, and so it makes sense for them to use the yuan for Chinese goods. This way, they save their dollars and their reserves. And China is not complaining. One more country using the yuan is good news for them. There is clear momentum behind the Chinese currency. Look at the numbers. Last year in 2022, the international usage of the yuan rose by over 26%. Over $6 trillion worth of payments were settled in the Chinese currency. The yuan has become the world's 5th largest currency for global payments. It comes after the dollar, the pound sterling, the euro and the Japanese yen. It is also the 5th most held currency in global foreign exchange reserves. Around 80 central banks keep the yuan in reserve and more banks are joining the list. Last year, a survey threw up some interesting results. It said most central banks in the world want the yuan in their reserves. How many? 85% of the world's central banks. They either have the yuan already or they're interested in building a yuan reserve. So clearly, the Chinese currency is emerging as a challenger to the US dollar. And today, a new report backed this trend. The dollar suffered another setback. In the month of March, the yuan became the most widely used currency for cross-border transactions in China. And this is a record. Almost $550 billion worth of yuan was exchanged. It was used in almost 49% of all transactions done with China. The trajectory looks good, but the yuan is far from becoming the world's go-to currency. This is the list of the most used currencies. And where do you see the yuan here? Near the bottom. The 8th most used currency in the world. Not even 2% of international payments are happening through the yuan as of now. The dollar still reigns supreme. In the month of January, it was used for over 45% of all global transactions. So the yuan is a challenger, but not a threat as of now. In order for that to happen, the yuan needs to beat currencies like the euro, the pound, and the yen. But that doesn't mean that the de-dollarization campaign is not real. Other currencies are rising. Countries want to reduce their dependence on the US dollar. Central banks are cutting back on the greenback. Earlier, the dollar had 71% share in reserves. Now it has fallen to 59%. That's a fall of 12%. Which other currency is challenging the US dollar? The Indian rupee is trying to. It's one of them. It's trying to ride the wave. India has launched an effort to internationalize the rupee. India's Reserve Bank is running a program. 18 central banks from around the world have signed up. They want to use the Indian rupee for trade with India. The list includes countries like Germany, Israel, Malaysia, New Zealand, Oman, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, and the United Kingdom. All these countries have opened special accounts that will allow them to use the Indian rupee. But it's still early days. The rupee is the new kid on the block. It was just last year that the RBI introduced the mechanism to facilitate trade in the rupee. But the timing couldn't have been better. The dollar's domination is waning, and there's opportunity for other currencies to fill the gap. We're in the age of artificial intelligence. It's still early days, but chatbots have taken the world by storm. People are using them for all sorts of things, from writing code to music to doing homework and taking an exam. And ChatGPT is turning out to be the most popular of these bots. It's challenging the limits of human imagination. Like, how far would you delegate work to a robot? Would you trust AI with therapy? Would you let a robot be your therapist? I'm not sure, but some people seem to be okay with the idea. They're talking to ChatGPT like they talk to their counselors and therapists. So is it an effective alternative? What do the experts say? Here's a report.
Mental health issues are rising around the world. Depression, anxiety, and stress are more common than we acknowledge. It's a pandemic we don't talk about enough. Between 2007 and 2017, mental health conditions around the world rose by 13%. The pandemic made it even worse. But are there enough avenues for recourse? Can technology help? Apparently, it already is. Chatbots are doubling up as therapists. OpenAI's super-hit chatbot, ChatGPT, is making news for this. It's being used by many people as a therapist. They talk to the bot about their issues, and it offers potential solutions. So what does a typical session look like? Say you type the words, "I'm under stress," or "I'm having anxiety." The AI tool will probably respond with something like this. "I'm sorry to hear that you're experiencing anxiety. It can be a challenging experience, but there are strategies you can try to help manage your symptoms." So it begins with a pep talk, followed by a list of recommendations that can help you navigate through the crisis. For instance, ChatGPT may ask you to get more sleep, cut down on caffeine and alcohol, and also suggest talking to friends and family. In case it's not already obvious, a lot of this is also what a human counselor will tell you in your initial sessions. It's pretty basic stuff, but apparently it helps. So much so that some people swear by the AI tool and are ready to replace their human therapists with it. But is this alternative advisable? While people with mental health issues may have a lot in common, each case is unique and different. Can chatbots really replace human counselors? Maybe in the future, but for now, experts are advising caution. And it's not just experts. ChatGPT itself puts out a disclaimer. It says it's not a replacement for a psychologist or counselor. Yet people turn to it because bot therapy is free. And that's a major inducement, given the fact that human therapists cost a lot for each session. In India, for instance, a 1-hour therapy session can cost anywhere between 2,000 to 4,000 rupees. And that's still a very conservative figure. In the US, 1 hour of therapy can set you back by anywhere between $100 to $200. So bots save you money. But will they be of any real help? Psychologists and psychiatrists are urging a lot of caution. AI therapy did end in catastrophe for some people. Earlier this year, a man in Belgium died by suicide. He was encouraged by ChatGPT to do so. And in the US, a New York Times columnist was encouraged to leave his wife. Not by ChatGPT exactly, but by Microsoft Bing. So bots may be good to chat with if you're feeling low, but this is not therapy. Not yet, anyway.
Our last story tonight is from space. Black holes have always intrigued humans. They're regions where the gravity is so strong that not even light can escape it. But astronomers have now come across an incredible image which shows something called a jet being launched from a black hole. And this is not the kind of jet that you see flying in the skies, the kind we call airplanes. These are different. These are jets launched from black holes. They're among the brightest objects in the universe, and the fact that they're escaping the black hole's immense gravitational pull is quite something. Our next report tells you what these jets are and what their launch from a black hole means. Have you ever seen a black hole? Chances are you haven't. You can't see them with naked eyes. In fact, black holes are so difficult to detect and photograph that the first image came out only in 2019. And when it did, leading newspapers around the world flashed it on their front pages. Because a black hole getting photographed was a big deal back then. Now, another image is doing the rounds. It's of the same black hole that was photographed in 2019. Only this time, the black hole is seen launching something into space. An extremely bright purple and orange jet. It's seen gushing out of the black hole. The new image was captured using 16 telescopes from around the world. This might look like a still image to you, but what's happening up there is anything but still. The image is like a screen grab. It only shows a moment of the jet's activity around the black hole. In reality, the jet's launch from the black hole would have been a very violent event. The black hole in question is a supermassive one, and it sits at the center of a nearby galaxy called Messier 87. This galaxy is about 54 million light years away from the Earth. And what's a light year? It's the distance traveled by light in 1 year. So the galaxy is pretty far. Time to get our basics covered. The black hole that has been photographed is 6.5 billion times the size of our sun. Hence the term supermassive. Black holes can explode with powerful jets. And one such explosion has been caught on camera in this image. Scientists still do not know how these jets are formed. They also don't know how black holes create such enormous explosions of energy. But there are some theories that have been floated. The most prominent one is this. The jets are probably powered by the rotation of the black hole. These jets would need an incredible amount of energy because escaping a black hole is close to impossible. The gravitational pull is so strong that not even light can escape. If you happen to go near one, you'll be swallowed in and will never be able to get out. But why is gravity so strong in black holes? Because a mind-boggling amount of matter is squeezed into a comparatively tiny space. The image of this jet is significant. It will help scientists understand black holes better and how they behave. Also why they seem to launch energetic jets at times. It will also help scientists launch ambitious projects farther into space. We are all living in very exciting times. The world knows more about space now than ever before, and developments like this one take us closer to solving the many mysteries of the universe. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Taiwan. A Ukrainian dance group performed in Taipei to showcase Ukraine's culture. The world of artificial intelligence keeps getting more fascinating. The video of a young girl turning into an old woman is doing the rounds. It's been described as hauntingly beautiful. And an American skiing record holder is practicing to shatter her own record. And finally, what makes April the 27th significant? We're taking you back in history. On this day, South African citizens of all races were allowed to vote. The year was 1994. The apartheid was coming to an end. Apartheid or apartness controlled the lives of people in South Africa for years. It kept the country's black majority population under the domination of white minority population. The racial segregation was rampant in all walks of life. Interracial marriages were banned. Black people did not have the right over their own land. They were not even allowed to vote. But on this day in 1994, there was a revolution at the ballot box. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. Exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.